For a long time, masculinity has been treated like something to define, to codify, to nail down. It's a set of traits or a role to fulfill, a standard to measure against. But what if that approach misses the point entirely?
As soon as we crystallize something and say, oh, the sacred masculine is this thing, that thing is now frozen. That thing lacks fire. That thing lacks substance or vitality. It flowers in each person differently, maybe in each season differently.
On this episode of The Cave and the Fire, I get to talk with Dr. Doug Shirley. Doug is a dear friend of mine. He's a professor and a therapist. He's a husband and a father, and he's somebody who was a classmate of mine over 20 years ago in seminary. But the first time I ever broached the idea of him coming to a retreat with me, he wasn't so enthused.
Boy, oh boy, was I freaking out when you all were talking. And so my body was doing some pretty interesting things that morning breakfast.
I remember you putting your fork down and you looked at me and said, Ned, this whole conversation just makes me want to throw up. Your body was having a visceral reaction.
Yes. And that's still where a lot of my energy lies, in my body, and my body often speaks and maybe speaks first, even before my mind catches up. So I was grateful I had that reaction. The phrase that I use consistently is that my rites of passage saved my life. I don't mean that by way of that I was suicidal. I probably mean that by way of my spiritual life. In my rites of passage, it was my body or my gut that was speaking again. And I would say it was an image of tar being scraped out of my gut. And I'd say it saved my life. So this belly that was talking that morning kind of consistently kept talking and led me places that I didn't know were possible.
Doug is a true intellectual. He has a way with words, a certain facility with ideas. And a lot of this episode, we're looking at ideas around masculinity and also foreshadowing some of the themes that Awaken is looking to address this coming fall. But as much as he has a way with words, he also is a man who is deeply embodied.
I'd done a lot of thought work. One of my ego defenses is to think. And I got a lot of horsepower up top, so I can do that. But what I hadn't done, I remember being back in Philadelphia one drunken night saying to a friend, my heart's too small, my heart's too small, my heart's too small. And so my sense is, part of what Illuman has allowed, maybe like the Grinch, is for my heart to grow. And I don't actually think it was too small, but I think it was like jammed in a box. And it was having a hard time beating, and it was a hard time, sending blood out to my extremities.
10 years later, no one would accuse Doug of having a small heart. And part of that process is the opportunity to be just another person in a room full of men. All day long during his working life, whether it's in the master's level psychology program where he teaches, people are looking to him for wisdom, for insight, for answers. Or when he's sitting with a client as their therapist and people are looking to him for questions and insight and guidance, people are looking to him, and there's a certain costliness for him of having to be that guy. There is for anybody in those shoes. And part of what the gift of Illuman has been is to be able to be in a place where the attention is on a common task and he's standing shoulder to shoulder with others.
That tension of you're immensely important and just not that important. I can't tell you how many times I've been so relieved in a band of brothers to find out how unimportant I am. And it's not disparaging. What I'm saying is not self-disparagement. Both have to be 100% true all the time. I'm immensely important, you're immensely important, and you're just not that important. Otherwise, the whole damn thing falls apart. Right? But to get to find out, because I'm so important, I don't have to be important right now. Because I know my place, my worth, my belovedness, I don't have to be important right now. I don't have to be center stage. I can be in service to whatever it is I'm service to with these brothers. I have found myself rooted that way, time after time after time after time.
Especially if you're wanting to get a little bit of a preview of Awaken this fall, or if you just simply want to hear more of Doug's story. You'll be glad you spent the time listening to the entirety of this interview on this episode of The Cave and the Fire.
Well, Doug Shirley, this is so cool that we get to hang out like this.
And we just ate lunch together.
I know.
It's kind of
I
fun.
know. It is good. It is good. Doug and I met back in like 2002 or three. We were classmates together in seminary, and since then you've gone on to great academic proclaim, and me on the other hand, it took 20 years just to finish that one master's.
Mhm.
But I remember, so this would have been like 10 years post grad school. You and I, the first time we ever spoke about Illuman was in 2014. We're having breakfast together with our buddy Paul and with a few other friends. And you had a pretty strong reaction to the
To
idea of
say the
men's
least.
work.
Yes.
Do tell.
It's fun that you started that way. I was going to tell that story too. Yeah, so you all wanted to have a conversation around this Illumin thing and men's work you were doing. And I remember you and I having conversations previously in the halls of our seminary, and I was not so interested. But I like to eat, so I figured I'd go to breakfast. And boy, oh boy, was I freaking out when you all were talking, because you were inviting me to consider, maybe reconsider men's work. I had grown up around a lot of men's work in the Christian church, and I hadn't necessarily seen that work bear fruit. I'd seen guys go off and maybe have a cheerleading session and feel good for a time, but I didn't necessarily see holistic transformation or care or love or consistency coming out of it. And so I wasn't interested in more of the same, more of what would have seemed flaccid or overinflated, or again, just kind of a rah, rah, rah session. And so my body was doing some pretty interesting things that morning breakfast, I remember.
You said, I'll never forget, you said, hearing, because I was not really reading you at the table per se. I was just, caught up in my own enthusiasm, which is probably a pretty normal for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I remember you putting your fork down and you looked at me and said, Ned, this whole conversation just makes me want to throw up, and then
Yes.
but I mean I know we're kind of laughing about it now, but there was a real you were being very real, like your body was
Yeah.
having a
Yeah.
visceral reaction.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And that's still where a lot of my energy lies, in my body, and my body often speaks, and maybe speaks first, even before my mind catches up. So I was grateful I had that reaction. Fast forward to then, I'm in my rites of passage with Illumin in Aravipa Canyon in 2016, and it was my body or my gut that was speaking again. And I would say it was an experience of making contact with, actually, it was an image of tar being scraped out of my gut that took me into therapy, because there was a lot to it. And that really, in some ways, I'd say saved my life. So this belly that was talking that morning kind of consistently kept talking and led me places that I didn't know were possible.
Yeah, and look at you now. Here you are, helping to actually convene Awaken, our national
I
gathering coming
know.
up.
I know. What's funny about it is when I said yes to it, I didn't really know this is what I was saying yes to. Which I think is probably a theme, you and I may touch on here today. Is just really, like, what are the things, what are the pieces of work that find us? So often if I try to go make something happen in my life, it fizzles or it fades. But boy, being found by something, that's really something. And so I knew I was signing up. So was very tickled to be a part of Awaken 2025. And then yeah, turns out I'm convener for this one, which is great.
And we're going to talk today about Awaken and masculine and a whole bunch of things. But I want to stay, before we kind of move into that direction, just, you've already said it, you've started, but I want to give you a chance to unpack a little more about the impact Illumin has had on you. Maybe some of the
Sure.
realizations that shifted for you, or what you know now that you didn't know before, and whatever direction you want to go there. But it's clearly, you wouldn't be doing what you're doing today with me if it hadn't borne fruit for you.
Yes. Yes. Well, the phrase that I use consistently is that my rites of passage saved my life. I don't mean that by way of that I was suicidal. I probably mean that by way of my spiritual life. And so I was, at the time that I did the rights. I was finishing a doctoral program. I'm a therapist by trade. I teach the stuff. I'm an academic. I'm a thinker. And so I was finishing a dissertation. And in fact, on the way to Aravaipa Canyon in the Phoenix airport, I got word from my academic advisor that I had asked for another extension to my dissertation, which, by the way, was on, in essence, the emotional lives of men in spiritual authority. So I was kind of already working on this sort of stuff. But I get this voicemail from my academic advisor. Not only would I not get an extension, but I had 3 weeks to finish the dissertation, or I'd get kicked out of the program due to statute of limitations. So again, I was all loaded up coming into my rights with all kinds of things. And I remember good friend Jeffrey Batstone, a couple of days in, kicking my pants because I was like, I had some good experience first couple of days. I thought, that's good. Now just sort of, I got to pace myself here because, I got to go home and finish this, these 3 chapters of this dissertation. But boy, oh boy, am I glad that Jeffrey kicked my backside that day by the river. I went home, I finished the dissertation. Literally the night that I turned in my final draft, I lost my mind. And that summer, I had the worst panic of my life. And typically, the way that I tell the story is I imagine it like a train with a bunch of cars. So I remember around that time, I filled out, I think it was like a juror form or something. How many years of schooling did you have? And it was something like 27. And so I imagined that I was sort of like this train with a bunch of cars that was just carrying stuff. This was my third graduate degree. So this train was just carrying stuff. Any grad or any educational experience is always unto something. So you're learning, but it's like, so that, right? It's not just the learning of itself. It's like, so that you can get a job or whatever it is. So I continue to just sort of carry a whole bunch of weight with me, sort of down these train tracks, if you will. And then, they call me doctor for the first time. I turn in the final draft of the dissertation, and literally, it's like those train cars went, just like the engine stops and just this crashing together. And I was miserable. And part of why I was miserable is there was room for things to catch up with me that simply hadn't had room to catch up with me until then. So this educational journey was done, but really what's more, I had maybe opened a bit of a portal, or a portal had opened for me, where through ritual and counsel and other experiences, I had a sense for the work that was before me, though I didn't know how to get through it, given the overwhelm and panic and all that sort of thing that I was experiencing. Got myself into therapy, which even that, I'm a therapist. Lots of therapists don't actually seek therapy. I'd been in therapy before, but it had been a while, and I kind of knew I needed to get back. And so this even kind of pushed me over the hump to say, I got to go get some help. And I did. In fact, I needed a lot of help that summer because I was still in a service position. And so I knew there was a risk that I could hurt people if I didn't take good care. And so that sense of that opening, that sense of that tar scraping took me back to infancy. There are stories of in my infancy, doctors misreading my chart, my medical chart, and telling my folks to prepare for my death. And so stuff like that was coming up. And space like that was created for me to engage. Again, I'd done a lot of thought work. One of my ego defenses is to think. And I got a lot of horsepower up top, so I can do that. But what I hadn't done, I remember being back in Philadelphia. This is before I moved out here to the Seattle area to go to seminary. I remember one drunken night saying to a friend, my heart's too small. My heart's too small. My heart's too small. And so my sense is part of the work, part of what Illuman has allowed, maybe like the Grinch, part of what Illuman has allowed is for my heart to grow. And I don't actually think it was too small, but I think it was like jammed in a box. And it was having a hard time beating, and it was a hard time, sending blood out to my extremities. And so it set me on a course. I went right back to help with the rites in 2017 as an initiator under Belden Lane, which was glorious. And you were doing something there. Do you remember 2017?
Yeah.
What was your you were helping the lead?
Yeah. I think I was one of the teaching elders, and I was the coordinator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
doing lots of good stuff. But that was such a gift to me to go back so quickly because I was so freaked out in 2016. And by the way, I don't mean to say to folks, come and get freaked out. But if you need to, the opportunities there, welcome. This was my journey, right? So I was able to come back in 2017 and see again, like see some of the structure behind the thing, understand more holistically what it was I'd been through, deepen the roots of some of the learning and transformation and healing and growth that had already started. And I don't know how many MRAPs I've been a part of now, 5 or 6. We've done a number of them here in Washington State. I got to be an initiator, helped to lead initiator program in Desroches in Vancouver, BC, 2 summers ago or 2 springs ago. I'm a pretty active member now in Washington and Pacific Northwest, on the Pacific Northwest board. I'm on the leadership gathering for Washington State. I'm now doing this for national. And this work grounds me. I'm an academic. I'll give credit where credit's due. This is your phrase, Ned. But if masculinity is a rhythm, then I would say the rhythm of Illuman has helped me define the rhythm of my masculinity over the 10 years. So I'm at my 10-year mark. This is a decade of experience. I guess that a decade after that formidable breakfast, but a decade of actual with Illuman. And I think my wife or my kids, anyone who's close to me would say I'm not the same person that I was 10 years ago. And I'm sure anyone would say that of anyone. But you're asking, what did Illumin do? I'd say it gave me a different sort of life than I'd known before.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So let's unpack that, because I'm already hearing you talk about how the community itself, it's not just the events. It's certainly not. I mean, the events are maybe
they're kind of placeholders.
Yeah, there's something a time that we gather, but early on in Illumin of Washington, I remember us talking about how we were aware that the magic of transformation and formation was happening in the web of relationships between us as much or more in some cases than in the power of the events themselves. Not to take away from these powerful events. I mean, they're powerful, but to just say, and you know what, sitting with somebody at coffee, going on a walk with them, spending a weekend camping together, there's something about the way we find ourselves in the midst of being shoulder to shoulder with each other that is even more potent, perhaps, especially when you let yourself kind of seep in that community, just sit in it and kind of stay with it over a period of time. You might not just be consciously aware of it at the moment, like how much we're being formed by who we're hanging out with, but we're being formed. So I'm hearing you say all of that because I know you well and I know where we're going to. And we're going to get to that. I want to hear you say more about that. But even just to talk a little bit about, let's just set the table in terms of masculinity. Yeah. Because this is such a strange word. An idea. So how do you personally understand masculinity? And maybe you could also touch on how that's evolved over time for you.
Yeah, well, I tried to take this on to some degree in that dissertation. So, it's been a spiritual task for me, emotional task, an academic task, a thinking task. Historically, masculinity has often sort of hovered, what we call hegemonic masculinity, traditional masculinity, has kind of hovered around the 3 Ps, being a protector, a provider, and a progenitor, making babies.
By the way, can we just say what in the world hegemonic means? I mean,
traditional. So sorry, that's the academic in me. So traditional. When you think about like when I don't know, probably especially let's say 20th century everyday person would be asked, what is masculinity? Maybe especially if they've been raised, again, I have a background in the Christian church, and so maybe especially if they've been raised in a similar context to me, white, suburbia, it probably would have been some version of these 3 Ps. To be a man is to protect, to provide, and to make babies. I don't, I got an ambivalent relationship with the 3 Ps. I see a place for them. But I also see how they've sort of served as a test or sort of like an expectation or a benchmark that if a man doesn't hit it, somehow he's a failure. So I don't, it's an interesting question, coming into today, like even how we have structured what's our title? Living the stories, discovering the sacred masculine. I should know it off the top of my head, but here
And
we are
look
in
at, I'll
March.
find it.
Okay. Well, I appreciated that we used the word discovery. And again, pardon my academic mind here, but what all of us were taught in like seventh grade English class, if we were raised in the States, was the science of discovery. And what the science of discovery says is that there's something out there to be found. And so we go and we try to find it, but ironically, what our method says is basically we have to disprove that there isn't a relationship to actually say there is a thing that exists, and we can't actually claim that a thing exists. We just say, this is our belief, and our research supports it. And so, masculinity to me in some ways is something that I live and breathe and feel and know and discover, as you say, when I'm with others. And when I'm with maybe especially a band of brothers where there's room for the wholeness of not just the three P's, but more than that, creativity, clarity, spontaneity, imagination. Generativity is probably a word that means more to me than most. I am an 8 on the Enneagram, and so I think of generativity not the same as productive. Okay, it's not productivity, but generativity, life force, vitality. There's something of that life force bringing weight or heft or energy or focus or imagination. It's our imagination that heals us. There's something of masculinity that creates and holds space for that sort of energetic work that brings forth life and love, not just on behalf of self, but on behalf of other. I don't think masculinity simply sacred masculinity. I don't think it simply looks after itself. I think it is a part of a larger whole. And so actually the more masculinity can be tethered with femininity in some ways, or at least, what we might have, one of the tools I used in my dissertation assessed androgyny, which would be sort of someone who says, I've got all kinds of gender dynamics going on here. I got lots of what we could call both masculine and feminine, but the masculine makes room for that which needs room. And so, sometimes masculinity means a group of guys getting together and holding space for what might look feminine, from the outside eye. I don't think that means it's feminine, but it hosts femininity, let's say. I think masculinity can also, again, provide structure and clarity. That's really essential. And so, in thinking about what we're not going to do at Awaken, or what we're not going to talk about in terms of
Don't worry about
masculinity.
that yet. We're going to get into
I
Awaken
know,
later.
I got it.
Oh,
But in thinking about like where we're going is we're not going to what it's not, right? So much conversation, like it would be so easy for me to say to you, well, here's what masculinity isn't. Because that's kind of like what we get these days, right? I think folks are afraid to say what they think it actually is or what they believe it actually is, right? And so it's not toxic. It's not something. It is something, and it's something that holds space for and clarifies on behalf of. How's that?
that's fantastic. Yeah. Now, I just want to clarify too, because I think upfront, so for anyone who's listening to this as a podcast and you're already going like, "Oh my God, this is a flood of ideas." I think that's the
See, I
point.
told you. See?
Yeah, yeah. Yep. It's and that's just to say what we're doing here is kind of some of the foundational idea work, which is important work to do. But we're going to get to what's that in support of? Because I
Yeah.
know for sure one thing about you, Doug, is that it doesn't end with ideas. It has to actually end in something that's embodied and
Yes.
visceral and
Yes.
in a beating heart and
Yes.
in the soul behind your eyes. So we're gonna get to
Yes.
that. In fact, and I
Yes.
think actually one of the ways we have gotten, I mean, I think it's just even to tell the story of how is it that we're doing what we're doing at Awaken coming up
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
this realization that I can't remember who it was. Somebody said that the community is the possibility of what we can't do alone. right? And I know that like you and I have both, and we're not the only ones. Like plenty of men, I've heard this is that you know they're like, I really don't care what the theme is for this
Mhm,
retreat that I'm going to, whether
mhm,
it's
mhm.
whatever. What the reason I'm going is to be in this relational field because something
Yes,
happens to me when I'm
yes,
shoulder to shoulder with these men, and some like
yes,
the best of me rises to the surface, parts of me that I didn't even know were there, and like
yes,
parts of me that maybe were like needing attention that I have not wanted to tend to somehow get tended to in a way that I couldn't tend to them on my own. And so
yes,
there's healing, but there's also like stepping into strength and immensity and a sense of beauty and dignity. There's a whole host of things that it's like this relational field. So this again that are maybe Illumin's greatest gift is not the ideas we offer, but the way we are together, right?
right. Right. And I'm an academic. Wind me up and let me go. I'll calm down here in a minute. Right.
No, I
But
love
part
it. This is
well,
great.
sure, sure. But to your point of like the person who's like, I don't know if anyone's gonna try to take notes of what I'm saying. But that sense of like sometimes we got to get our ideas out so we can actually land
Yes.
somewhere, right? And so
Yes.
I mean, that is, even again, your question, masculinity, what is it? It's working to and making space for landing, for grounding, not just in the self, right? Kareem Aziz, one of our elder brothers, in the vision group as we were planning for Awaken, said, the best thing we have to offer the world is who we are. Back to my rights. They would not have been what they were if you hadn't been there every Pequeña. If Jeffrey hadn't kicked my backside by the river, whatever day that was of my rights, if on my day of wandering I don't know if I can say this without crying. Oh God, if Paul Steinke hadn't blessed me on my way out, like it just simply wouldn't have been what it was had we not had that holding space or that container that we were actively creating and supporting together. So there's something of that is masculine, that is sacred, and that we're after.
And what I'm hearing you say also in the midst of the beautiful words you shared is that the sacred masculine, we can't talk about it as something that flowers in every person in the same way, right? And in fact, I think, I don't know if you and I have really talked about this, but if I was to just go in a little bit of a side rant that I hadn't planned on going, like one of the things I don't love about kind of those four classic archetypes of the warrior, lover, magician, and king is that it's this vision of like of wholeness where you want to have all four of them so that you are a man and everyone else is trying to have those four together too.
Yeah,
And
right.
it's actually like we're all trying to kind of look in this same way on this hero's journey, as
Yes,
opposed to thinking of masculinity as something that can really flower and look radically different
yes,
in
yes,
different bodies, right? It
yes,
manifests
yes,
different in different
yes,
bodies. And the goal is not to start to like look like that man over there. It's to look like me, to
yes,
be all of me that I can.
yes,
So we're going to have this conversation like as a group. And in this way, we can't really say what does it mean to be a man? Like cuz we can't answer that by
right,
ourselves, right?
right,
Like an answer or a response worthy of the question. It seems the only question we could ask is what does it mean to be men? What does it mean to be
yes,
men? And ask it
yes,
while we're together. Because
yes,
somehow, while we're together and we're bringing kind of all of the beautiful diversity of the ways the masculine shows up
yes,
in our varied bodies, our varied
yes,
backgrounds, like all of that, maybe then as I start to see how it's being like kind of popping up all over in other people, I can start to understand what it means for me to be a man as well in
yes,
that space. Yeah.
yes, yes. I love what you're saying, and again, pardon my academic mind here, but I have a colleague who says nouns are first verbs in Verla. That's what I hear you speaking to, right? As soon as we crystallize something and say, oh, the sacred masculine is this thing, that thing is now frozen. That thing lacks fire. That thing lacks substance or vitality. And so, if I teach systems classes, and so a common phrase in systems thought is the thing is not the thing. Again, if we were to go to awaken together and sort of focus on a topic and say, this is what it means. Okay, in 21st century America, to be a man means to provide. Well, I think I spent a lot of my younger years really working my ass off and trying to provide. I'm not sure that I was the best version of a man I could be because I had a thing in mind. And because what I was doing was different than my being, and kind of to the point I hear you making, I wasn't in a collective that was allowing me to do and be the sacred masculine that's evolved for me over time as I understand for sure I need to provide. But provision, again, needs to be verb as much as it is noun and needs to shapeshift. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's emotional. My youngest son's 12 and is going through middle school. I don't know how anybody survives middle school. Right. And so a lot of provision for him. Sure. We're putting a roof over his head, but it's every day like, buddy, how'd it go today? And man, that's tough. Right. And even stoking his anger when he's upset that a kid has said a thing to him that he shouldn't say. Right. So I love what you're working on there. The thing is not the thing. If we try to codify, I don't even know how many descriptions I gave of the sacred masculine when they asked the first time, right? But that's what I hear you saying, that is it flowers in each person differently, maybe in each season differently. So what does the sacred masculine look like in this season will be different for you and I than it was a year ago.
Yeah. 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 And it's just because you've brought it up, and I want to name these things when they get brought up. Even this idea of being a provider, that is such a recent, it is so recent in history that got attached to men.
Right.
I mean, if you were to go back for it is a modern kind of industrialized construct.
Yeah.
But for most of history, women have been just like provider has been just as much. It's not really been a masculine thing. It's just been a human thing, and that is one that I would be all for, just to say, I hope we could drop that, because I think it's caused us more. I think it's caused us probably more problems than it's helped solve, and it's baked into a little bit of. I think it actually when you understand it as coming from kind of late capitalism, industrial age, provision as kind of this solo go out in the workforce on behalf of my nuclear family back home. It starts to actually, I think, bake in a whole bunch of assumptions, which of course all gender categories do that. They can't help but do that. But I just want to kind of tease them and tear them apart and question them, kind of interrogate them a little bit when we can. So, okay, so let's get to some examples from your life. Okay,
great.
So I'd be curious to know, what has this actually? I mean, this is all well and good, and it's true. I know it's true. It's true for you. It's true for me. But could you give some, are there any examples, times you feel like men, and you have given some already, but just times when men have reoriented you or helped you find yourself or helped you face something that you couldn't have faced alone, or anything else, in terms of how you have felt this, the presence of community itself has come to bear in, I'll even just say a salvific way.
Sure. Great. I was knowing that we were going to do this podcast this morning. I was just kind of listening as I was doing my yoga practice. I was listening just to my own life and mind of what were the stories that came. One story actually predates my work with Illuman, which I think is actually helpful. So my wife and I have been married for, 20, we're going to be 22 years. So we've seen the same couples therapist for nearly 23 years. There was a time, I'm going to guess, so if my rights were 10 years ago, I'm going to guess this is probably 12, 13 years ago. I'm sitting in this couples therapist's office with our therapist, Steve, who's, an elder to me, a man who's older, who's walked before me. We'd already seen him for a bunch of years. He knew our story. He knew each of us really well. But I was kind of feeling picked on by him. I was feeling like, my wife was getting the better end of the therapeutic deal. And I felt like he was kind of being hard on me. And so one day I got up enough guts to say something. And he had said something to me, and I think I don't remember exactly what I'd said back. And he went to shift the conversation. And I said to him, I'm not done with you yet. If you can imagine, he was sitting like a therapist sits, legs crossed, all the things. But the thing that I'll never forget, and again, I have a hard time talking about this without crying. The thing that I'll never forget is that he opened his body to me, and he opened his legs, and he opened his hands, and he said, okay. And then he made space for my complaint, and he heard me, and he received what I had to say. And so that stance is for me what I want to be about in the world. So then fast forward, this Illuman work that you and I do together, one of the things, so again, I carry that image of Steve with me in my heart, that turning and opening, that posture of turning and opening and making space. I don't remember when exactly it was that you and me and Jeffrey Batstone and Paul Stanky decided we needed to gather a couple times a month to just be together. And so our Monday morning 6:30 times have saved my bacon so often, especially on the mornings where I don't feel like going. It's one thing to reach out to a friend when you're in need, kind of SOS, right? It's another to not even know that you need something and find out that you need something midstream. And to have a rhythm and a container and a relationship and a community and a love and a fortitude that actually, once you get there, you find out what it is you need. So gosh, Annette, I don't know how many times we've sat together on a Monday morning, and at the beginning of the hour, I'm grumpy that I got to be there just because I'm tired or whatever, or it's Monday or whatever it is, or probably even more so, I don't want to face the thing that's already probably bubbling up that I don't necessarily want to bubble up, right? And then we're together, and someone asks, "How am I doing?" And that's all it takes for the thing to unwind. And so when I think of what holds me together, one of the things that holds me together most is our Monday morning times.
It is such like a treasure that we have this, and
Yes.
it's such a tragedy that so many men do not have like the depth of
Yes.
relationship that I think they long for, even though they might not know, or they only suspect that it could actually exist in such a rich way. But yeah, yeah,
And a lot of times we
male.
laugh, right? A lot of times we are just goofy
Oh yeah.
as hell, right? We get together and just kind of are silly together. And that is absolutely wonderful. And that feeds me as much as then the heartfelt times that are kind of like what I was just describing.
Mhm, mhm. So help me. I want you to put your academic hat on here again. And I hope you didn't feel like I was like asking you to be less of that, because I wasn't. I was
No,
just
no, I
trying to
get it. No,
orient.
no.
Actually, that's a
I
beautiful way the masculine flowers in you is,
yes.
your
Yes.
brain power. So, I mean,
Yes.
that's bring it, without apology. So there has been, I'll try to attempt to say this, but I know you're going to be able to say this with more nuance and probably reference points as well. So there's, part of what we think of when we talk about our stories is that we almost always in the West think about my story. Okay, I'm talking about my
Yes.
life. If I'm going to do life
Yes.
review, then that means like, okay, so it starts when I was born and kind of goes on
Yes.
from there. We don't actually think of like if we were in other parts of the world, in other cultures, we would be thinking, okay, life review. Well, this is the story of my people, or this is the story of my nation, or my like the
Mhm.
this is the story of the corner of the earth in which I live, and we'd be or these are stories actually of if we were to review life, we might be telling stories of the more than human world that seemingly have no connection even to us, but do in fact shape,
Mhm.
especially like an indigenous worldview.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there's a sense in that we're saying we can't really even imagine who we are alone with outside the context of our communal stories. That our communal stories have far more to say about us than we suspect, and maybe more than our individual stories. Okay.
Yes.
So riff on that, because this is I mean, you get into like kind of postmodern thought, and then even what's
Hmm.
come after postmodern thought,
Hmm.
like it's
Yes.
really underlined this. Is there a self,
Yes.
a
Yes.
separate from context?
Yes.
How,
Yes.
where's that? Go wherever you want with that.
Yeah, yeah. I was saying to my therapist this past week, I'm just kind of done with the Western notion of self. I mean, we keep saying this thing of like, the thing is not the thing, right? Because we've created this sort of freestanding entity that can supposedly have a story that's kind of like the hero's journey put in Hollywood perspective, right? Or like put in the like rise and fall and all the things that you're typically used to with a good story. But I mean, you asked for my academic mind, but I just kind of went to a bit personal. If on first blush, of anyone who's ever named a child knows just what you're talking about. That there is a whole story that goes with naming another human being, right? Like when I think about my three boys, Noah, Luke, and Eli, they came out into a story that had name attached to it, right? Whether it's their conception or again their name, there is so much story embedded in every one of our experiences. We think, it's sort of like, in the Hebrews thought that the day started at dusk, and we go to sleep, and God goes to work in the world, and then we wake up and join God and God's work on our behalf. Well, it's sort of like we think we wake up as human beings. Oh no, here's my story. And, especially in my field, it's like, oh, what happened to us when we were young is what sets the tone for the rest of life. I went to, so here's an academic piece. I went recently to a training by a liberationist analyst, a Latin American guy, Dr. Daniel Gatzambide, who talked about the dyadic default that sits in Western psychology. And here's what he means. Okay. If you
You
were
have
to
to say what
imagine,
dyadic, what
yeah,
even that mean. Yep.
yep. Give me a minute. I'm a good academic. I give my definitions. Okay, dyadic default. So imagine a papa is like holding his son face to face, or a mama is holding her baby and maybe breastfeeding. Dyadic, two-person, interpersonal exchange. Default. What Dr. Gatzambide was saying, here in the West, we imagine being the recipients of a story that we then go tell. Again, it's this consumeristic, capitalistic thing, right? We go tell a story. It's almost like a product that we create and can then deliver. But what Dr. Gatzambide is saying, so that's in the global north. We tell stories of dyadic default, which is really what happened to me. Did I get what I needed? Maybe especially early in life. How did that set a tone for my personality, for what's often called my attachment style, for my the injuries and wounds that I carry through life, and then what do I need to address that story to heal? In comparison with, if you were to imagine a mama in the global South who might have a baby strapped to her back, where now the same closeness between mama and baby exists, but both are now facing out to the world. Am I doing an okay way to describe this? So rather than it being like a gaze face to face, now they're facing the world together. Now they're, in some ways, they're looking at a larger story together, a collective together, that they might miss if they were simply just locking eyes and sort of staring at each other face to face. And so what Dr. Gatzambide argues from a collectivist framework is that is the work of being mammal and human, maybe even the work of recovering from some of what Western psychology has told us of you are a self, you have a story, it's your job to tell your story, sort of excavate and tell your story, and then live your best life. What of the stories that are all around us, feeding us all the time, that we're sort of facing together with caregivers and loved ones? Those stories that hold us in place. This place where I'm sitting today is where I do a lot of my work, both academic and my therapy work. Out to my left is my yard, which is gorgeous. My wife does great work out there. But man, from time to time, woodpecker come. Every once in a while, coyote come. lots of squirrels and birds and things. And I am so taken that often by, here I am, so I do therapy by telehealth, right? Dyadic default. Usually it's me and another person, right? They're telling me their story, right? But what happens is something breaks in, right? Something out of the corner, a woodpecker on this nurse tree out my window catches my eye. And invariably it connects, if I'm open to it, it connects with something that's happening in that dyadic default space. In other words, the default is blown open, right? At a time where I didn't even necessarily know that I needed it to be blown open, nor did the other person. Or here's another thing. Again, sometimes I get my students know I get kind of woo-woo. In the world of counseling and psychotherapy these days, we do a lot of telehealth. You and I are recording this online. I think it's really interesting to notice when the internet cuts out. When a person is getting ready to say something they haven't said before, and all of a sudden I have to crane my neck because they're doing the max headroom thing, or I can't hear them, right? And so this notion of we can seek and find stories, but often the stories that we're looking for are way too prescribed, way too thing oriented, way too outcome oriented, way too predictable. These stories that I'm talking about break in. They emerge when I don't know that. I was meeting with a client this morning. We were talking about the rain. 30 minutes into the time, the sun comes out. By the end of the hour, we're talking about, from her framework, a God that she grew up with that was way too small, that told her when things went wrong, it was because of her. And how we got there was me looking out at the sunshine and saying, there's something of even me being held by, she and I are talking rain, but now there's sun, being held by the sun emerging in a time where we didn't think it was supposed to emerge, that actually helps to shed light on, here's my woo-woo, shed light on the story that's emerging in this individual person. It's about a connection that she and I are making, but in that moment, she's making lots of connections with lots of stories that have held her back. Things are opening up. She's seeing a universe and a divinity. We're talking about shifting from a story of against, shifting from a story where she's been used to a world that's working against her, forces that are working against her, to saying, like, what if this universe was for me? Just like the sun begins to emerge in a time where I thought that there was going to be rain, just like how I thought that divinity was sort of cramped into this little box, and I'm finding out maybe not so. Maybe I can belong in the world, especially as I seek to advocate for myself. So that's maybe a very lived and palpable notion of, in the course of a therapy hour where historically the work would be to tend to an individual story, there was no such thing as an individual story happening there. There was layers upon layers of story that evolved over the course of the hour that just got bigger with time.
And our own our myopic perspectives, in which we just are training to see one thing, and so that's what we
Yes.
see, have so
Yes.
blinded us. But I would say it's interesting. We have to say that this is like woo woo to somehow expect and
Right.
anticipate, because actually, given like
Yes.
the data of how
Yes.
often these kinds of things happen,
All the time.
you have to say, well, of course, why would we not be anticipating this? And indeed,
Yes.
I think my assumption is that you, in fact, actually are. And one of
I
the reasons
am.
that you'd be such a wonderful therapist is that you're listening not just for the person who's speaking, but for wider circles that also
Yes.
might want to get in on
Yes.
the conversation. So this gets into now we're talking about a tribe, and or a band, even like a band of brothers, right? That
Yes.
language really, it comes from Shakespeare, but then like when we see it in the World War II kind of series, there's something that's so galvanizing for men. It speaks. It's like, oh, like, I want to be a part of a band of brothers. What
Yes.
what does that even mean? And I think it also it also speaks to how the hero's journey, in which kind of the individual leaves all community behind and goes out into the woods. Look, I love those stories. There's nothing. I'm not to say. And if we were to understand them in a sense, he's never really leaving community behind. He's leaving a familiar community behind, entering into other communities.
Sure.
But there is still this kind of individual. But I think you and I have both been taken by
stories where it actually centers a community rather than an
Yes.
individual, like stories
Yes.
like the Lord of the Ring,
Yes.
where the Fellowship of the Ring, you think about like how widely varied masculinity shows up in Frodo, or compared to
Sam.
Gandalf,
True. Hmm.
or yeah, or
Hmm.
Mary
Hmm.
versus Gimli,
Hmm. Hmm.
or there's
Hmm.
like this wide variety, and that somehow they're in this. They are only able to, like, if they all tried to flatten and become like Aragon, or
Yeah.
become Gandalf,
Yeah.
like they wouldn't get there, right?
Yeah.
There's actually something about them being true to who they each were made to be, and that's just one, but there's story after story like that, both mythically and also, I mean, there's and also, I would say historically, that gets to that. So that,
Yes.
I think that gets to a little bit of what we're
Yes.
hoping to do is look at some of these wider
Yes.
stories that somehow hold us.
Yes. Yes. Layers, right? Layers upon layers, right? The thing that comes when I hear you say that, Ned, is, when I take, again, here's my Western psychological mind. When I take a lot of developmental theory and I put it together with my own spiritual tradition, here's how I think about the human experience. I think about it kind of existing on a spectrum of importance, where on one side of things, I'm just going to talk about you for a minute. On one side of things, you are an absolute miracle. There is only one of you in the universe. You are a gift from God. The hairs on your head are counted. It is amazing, the creativity and diversity and specificity that makes you you. On the other side of that spectrum, you're just not that important, right? And if here's the tension of it, Ned. If both of those things, you are immensely important and you're just not that important, your life is not about you, right? Your life is here in service to the whole, to something larger, connected to the whole. Again, you were named by someone who was named by someone who's named by someone, right? Your life just simply isn't about you. That tension of you're immensely important and just not that important. I can't tell you how many times I've been so relieved in a band of brothers to find out how unimportant I am. And it's not disparaging. What I'm saying is not self disparagement. Both have to be 100% true all the time. I'm immensely important, you're immensely important, and you're just not that important. Otherwise, the whole damn thing falls apart, right? But to get to find out, because I'm so important, I don't have to be important right now. Because I know my place, my worth, my belovedness, I don't have to be important right now. I don't have to be center stage. I can be in service to whatever it is I'm service to with these brothers. I can't tell you how nourishing that is, to be reminded in that full hearted way how unimportant we are, because there's something other that needs tending in the moment. I have found myself rooted that way time after time after time after time.
Mhm.
So it's stories, and
Yeah.
maybe I'm kind of doing both these two themes we're working on, right? Stories, right? The stories are always bigger than us. The stories never stop with us, right? And our friend Paul Stanky says brokenness is never the end of the story, right? So the thing that seems to be the sort of showstopper for us is often the very thing that needs to precipitate the next thing. But the next thing may not be for us, right? The next thing might be for the person that we're loving or caring for in any given moment, right? And so it takes a while to sort of be found, to be held in that sort of framework where I can know, because I come from something larger that's immense and that holds me, I don't have to question my worth. A lot of men are going to come to awaken, and they're going to need some of that experience. They're going to need to be held by something larger so they know they don't have to question their worth. So that by the time they leave, they can go out saying, I'm also just not that important. It's not time for me to come back and have life now meet me where I am. Rather, where do I meet life in a larger story that has already beckoned to me in the form of me going to this retreat that we're going to put together in November, right? So that sense of being able to be filled, to be able to pour out, to be able to be filled, to be able to pour out. Our 12-step friends know for sure, right? We are the healthiest when we're giving, when we're aware that we're just not that important. Right. In my field, there was a study of rhesus monkeys picking the nits out of each other's fur. And the question was, which monkey had more oxytocin, which is sort of the bonding hormone? Which monkey has more oxytocin, the one that's picking the nits or the one that's getting their nits picked? You want to guess?
I'd say probably the one picking them. I don't know.
Yeah, right? Yes, being rooted in love and a band of brothers, a story that's bigger than us, so that we can love and serve the world is where we're going to find the greatest nourishment. This dyadic default is killing us.
I don't think we'll be picking each other's nits at Awaken, though, right?
We could.
So this gets what I'm hearing you describe gets into this idea that I love, this idea of thinking of masculinity as a rhythm much more than something
It's
that's
phenomenal.
fixed.
Have you written on it yet?
No, I haven't written on it, but
everyone who's listening, send Ned correspondence that he needs to write on masculinity as rhythm. Okay.
Yeah. So it's this notion that it is, the masculinity is neither erect nor flaccid. It's the movement between the two.
Yes.
It's neither withdrawal nor insertion. If it's just constant insertion or constant withdrawal, I mean, there's no life there, right? And so it's actually this like discerning movement back and forth between the two. It's the tide coming in, the tide going out. And there's this sense, I think, of what I'm hearing you say is that whenever we try, if we're going all the way back to the beginning, part of the problem, if we go all the way back to the beginning, okay, whenever we buy into the illusion of separation. So now we're really back at the beginning.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Whenever we start to buy into the illusion of separation, then that somehow it's incumbent on me to do something about it. And so you start, I mean, how else could we end up with the patriarch we've ended up with? I mean, it makes total sense to how we would have gotten there. Like, so there was this, and this story of the children of God out in the desert, the children of Israel, which I love that. There's a collective, it's about the group, right? Discovering who they are together as a people, that so much of their lostness was like learning like again and again to be flexible, to be resilient, to not demand that things go in a particular way, but learn to be able to abide with the harshness of life. And to trust that like sufficient, like that there would be, there might not be abundance, but there'd be sufficiency, which is really like, which is actually more than enough as it turns out, So this is getting way too back, but let me try to bring it back in. So whenever we're in that illusion of, I got to be this way, I'm separate, I'm not, and I have to make something, then that's where the impulse to crystallize is, I think, the word you use, to crystallize and this is what it means to be a man, a real man, damn it, and I'm going to be this. And no matter what you choose, no matter how good it is, there might be a lot of good in the things that you're crystallizing. Okay.
Yes.
But now in that rigidity, you make yourself small. We become small. We're living a story that is not sufficient for the day. Right. And so now, as you start to actually let go of those old stories and allow it to be something much more like a current or the beating of a drum, isn't it interesting that even as we both become more important and less important at the same time, I mean, both were true always. We're just waking up to our importance and waking up to our insignificance, which doesn't threaten the ego anymore at all, right? It's actually kind of relieving, as you say, that now that there's the, who is it that's been using the word immensity next to men so much? Francis Weller, right?
Weller, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So which I so appreciate, because, we have heard, I mean, isn't the problem that men take up too much space, right?
Yes, right.
So to have someone like Francis Weller say, actually, there's a certain quality of immensity that he's calling men into. Would you, that's probably closer to you. What would you say about immensity and rhythm and manhood?
Great. Well, here, because I think I'm still working on the illusion of separation too. So let me see if I can do both.
Okay, go ahead. Wherever you want to go.
Okay, here's what my mind was doing while you were talking about separation. So if we're cut from a whole, imagine a whole window piece of glass, something like this. We're cut from a whole, and we believe that there needs to be separation. The glass shatters. And I think what we've all experienced in life is the shattering of the illusion of separation. Meaning, like I grew up with two siblings, if I'm different people than them and it's my job to be distinct, it's my job to be my own person and make my own way, to sort of abide by that separation. Oh, I'm glad I'm not like this or that. There's a shattering, there's a fragmentation that happens. And so then we all walk around feeling that fragmentation. And so in the midst of fragmentation, then what we look for is clarity. And so oftentimes when someone tells us, okay, this is the path to healing, this is what you need to be as a man, here's the test of whatever the thing is, that version of clarity seems to take our fragments and make something of them. But it doesn't really do anything with them, right? It maybe just takes one or two and says, here's this piece or that piece. And so healing means to take our fragments and understand they were a whole, right? Bill Plotkin talks about holing, WHOLING, that life is about holing. We were whole, right? Kids are closest to the divine. And then our lives fragment and shatters us. Patriarchy splits us in two. And then we live by this sort of illusion of separation that you're speaking to. And the work is to bring the fragments back together. You've got some of my fragments. Paul's got some of my fragments. Jeffrey's got some of my fragments. My father does. My three sons do, right? Those fragments spread. And so we look for clarity, believing it's going to resolve the fragmentation, but it doesn't. All it does is take one or two pieces and tell us what to do with that. Okay, so now move to your question around immensity. I think immensity is in some ways what Plotkin's speaking about of holding. It's understanding that there is something so much bigger than you or me that is calling to us, beckoning to us. And when we close our ears and just sort of either do the dyadic default thing or think the thing that I'm doing is what's most important and I cut off from whatever else it is, I don't get a chance to heal the fragmentation that's been with me since my childhood. I don't get a chance to engage with the 120-year-old elder that exists in me because I'm not looking for it. And so there's a whole, WHOLE, that again, I came from and that I'm going to, that falls apart in fragments and I lose touch with. The immensity that I think Weller's speaking to is not, Ned, you are one of the immense people, one of the most immense people I know in my life. But that's not actually what he's saying, I don't think. I don't think he's saying it's time for Ned to be immense. It's time for Ned to take his fragments of immensity and join them together with, like me, in this podcast. And you and I begin to make art with our fragments that begins to reflect something different that's immense that we couldn't reflect when we were abiding by the illusion of separation. How to do?
Beautiful. Beautiful. And so, as it is between the two of us, so it will be in November with several hundred of us as
Yes.
we all bring our fragments together. I mean, now I risk kind of going out of my depth here, referencing something I really don't know. But I'm okay looking foolish. So I'm just hearing my Howard's voice in my head. Howard is a friend of Doug's and mine who's in Washington, one of my dear friends, and he's Jewish. And so is it Tikkun Olam? This, and it is like this sense that, and I'm now hearing Glenn too. In fact, I'm sure Glenn and Howard are both shaking their heads, going, "Oh my God, he's just slaughtering our tradition." But let me just say it this way, with all apologies to my like clumsiness around this language. It's this notion that in the beginning there was this great shattering. There was a great shattering, and that the shards were distributed
Yes.
through all of creation, not just humanity,
Yes.
all the entire universe. There was a
Yes.
great shattering, and that really what life is all about is picking up those shards and bringing them back
Yes.
together, bringing them back
Yes.
together. And I love that that pottery tradition in I think it's South
Kitsugi.
Korea.
Hmm.
Yeah, where they when they
Hmm.
bring the brokenness together,
Hmm.
what is the
Hmm.
soldering agent they
Hmm.
use? It's pure
Yes.
gold. It's literally pure
Yes.
gold. And then
Yes.
as actually it's not, so we're not running to returning to a wholeness that was
Right.
before. No, there's
Yes.
the
Yes.
shatteredness remains,
Yes. Yes.
but the edges where
Yes.
there's been like a rebonding, actually those edges that are gold in the Korean tradition, like those are the places that actually maybe bear
Yes.
the most.
Yes.
And if we were to bring
Yes.
this even full circle back to what you said, oh, go ahead, you want to say something?
Just, I mean, again, academic mind, philosophers that study beauty will say there's two dilemmas with beauty. One is it's particular, meaning your fragments, your what you contribute to immensity. Back to, again, there's only one of you in the universe. Your beauty is so particular. There's only one. But also, beauty is always interacting with brokenness. For something to be beautiful, there has to be some element of asymmetricality. I don't know if I just made up a word. Something that was broken and put together back with pure gold, right? Something of a sense of non-wholeness being brought into an experience of wholeness that requires particularity, right? You think about, again, there was rain this morning. And then the sun broke in, and it was like, oh my God, every part of me felt filled, right? But it was because I knew the experience of the darkness of rain that brings the beauty of sun. So beauty requires deliberation. John O'Donohue says it's beauty that saves our lives. Beauty envelops truth. Beauty requires fragmentation, right? So we're hoping brothers will bring their fragments. Here's what I was taught what it means to be a man. Here is the dyadic default. Here's what I was told about me growing up. I've carried this diagnosis, or I've seen myself this way, or, this is what the church told me, or I screwed the church, I went out on my own, whatever it is, right? We're asking brothers to bring their fragmentation, bring their stories that have been cut off from the whole, because we believe there's something of beauty. You said that, there's the gold that's between, right? So fire is part of what will sit between us and fashion the pieces of us together. That's immensity. That's beauty. And it requires brokenness and fragmentation. So if anyone is perfect, they probably shouldn't come to Awaken, right? That's also not very immense. Because anyone who struggles with perfectionistic tendencies knows how small they feel, knows how small they feel to have to get it just right, right? So to know that you can screw something up and screw it up royally is beautiful, is healing. And so it's
Hmm.
that sort of expanse that I think we're going to
Hmm.
try to be after in the coming year.
Hmm. Beautiful, beautiful. So that's it. I mean, the great thing is we might say almost none of that actually at Awaken.
Sure, sure, that's
Because
right. Who
the
knows?
goal of Awaken will be actually to embody that, not necessarily talk in
Yes,
this kind of in this
that's right.
particular way that you and I've been rapping back and forth about, which I know
That's right.
we really enjoy. But that, like, we'll actually we'll be seeking to step into that field together,
Yes.
and usually to do that, the best language is poetry or myth,
Yes.
and the words coming from another brother who's sitting, right next to you. So those will
Yes.
probably be the terrain and the language with which we'll be speaking. But so
Yes.
grateful
Yes.
to share this. So we're coming up on time for you. I do
Hmm.
want to ask just a couple quick questions if we have time.
Great.
First of all,
Great.
it's a question I love asking everybody, and that is like, young men especially, they're facing what a world young men are facing right now. And you and I both have
Mm,
teenage sons, right,
mhm,
and young adult
mhm,
sons. What wisdom, not just thinking about your boys, but just in
mhm.
general to young men, would you give about how to navigate masculinity in today's world?
My oldest, Noah, it's probably a month or so ago, um, was sitting in his car in our driveway for a long period of time. And he came in and said, "Oh, sorry, I was on the phone with Stoli." Stoli is an elder in the Pacific Northwest, infamous by even just a part of his last name, Paul Stoltenberg. It For my father's heart, it doesn't get any better for my son to be sitting in the driveway in his car for an hour speaking to an elder who's devoted an hour of time to my son. And so, what I would say is, if you're a young man, if you're a young person, and you're seeking something larger than yourself, be on the lookout for a mentor, be on the lookout for an elder, be on the lookout for someone who might be willing to pour into you. And boy, oh boy, if you get one, grab a hold. Ask them if they'd be willing to meet with you from time to time. Tell them about your life. My son, Luke, my middle son, last night, got home late because he had a meeting with an elder in his life. And I got to ask him a little bit about that time with him. And he just said, we went to Taco Bell. And I forget the nutty sugar-filled drink that they got, but it was sitting in Taco Bell with Garrett and just rapping. It's what you're speaking about, Annette. It's rhythm. It's find a rhythm where you can have someone your age is wonderful. But again, if there's someone who's walked a bit ahead of you, who can just simply then walk with you, if you can be on the lookout for opportunities to plug into relationships and mentorship that way, my God, will the world be a better place?
Mhm. Beautiful, beautiful. And I'll just say, since many of the men who are listening to this are actually older men, not younger men, that part of what we're doing and what Doug is just doing right there is what Walter Brueggemann would say is cultivating the prophetic imagination. And that we actually, like, the first step towards that is imagining it to be true. And the issue is that these young men are not going to imagine that that's even a possibility for them.
That's right.
It was because Doug was connected to a community of men that dreamed this on Noah's behalf, on Doug's son's behalf, right?
That's right.
And so the invitation for all of us who are older, okay, is, okay, start to dream about how you and the men you know might start to pour yourself into a younger man, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Gorgeous.
Let's leave it there, Doug. That is such a beautiful, what a beautiful conversation. I love you so much. You,
I love you, brother.
my goodness, what a Doug and I and Paul and Jeffrey. I mean, these are men that I will, long after I've lost all of my faculties, I see us rocking on a porch in a chair together,
Yes.
and maybe beyond words to really talk or remember, but just admiring the beauty of a sunrise. So
Yes.
what a delight to be able to actually do the podcast with you. This has been lovely.
Thanks for the invitation.
So, yeah. Peace.